April 18, 1942. The deck of the USS Hornet slick with spray and shuddering under the weight of aircraft that had no business being there. 16 B-25 bombers crouched on the carrier like hulking beasts in a cramped pen, their wings stretching out over sailors who looked at them with a mix of awe and disbelief. The air was salted and sharp, the horizon gray with storm, and every man who watched knew he was seeing something that bent the laws of probability. Army bombers on a Navy ship, an unholy marriage born of desperation. It was, quite literally, a raid that should not have been possible. For months earlier, Pearl Harbor had been left in flames, and the United States, stunned and bruised, had staggered to its feet. The Japanese Empire stretched across the Pacific like a rising tide, its troops advancing in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Americans hungered for something to shift the balance, even if only in spirit. Franklin Roosevelt understood it better than anyone. He wanted Japan to feel fear on its own soil, to remind the world that America was not only capable of absorbing a blow but of striking back with imagination and audacity. Enter Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, a man known for breaking records in the air and defying logic with his restless energy. He was asked to attempt the unthinkable, launch medium bombers from a carrier deck and hit the Japanese homeland. He accepted, without hesitation, even though the plan was stitched together with more hope than certainty. The preparations were as meticulous as they were hurried. Bombers were stripped of excess weight, armor plates removed, defensive guns replaced by broomsticks painted black to deceive enemy fighters, fuel tanks crammed into every spare cavity. Pilots trained on impossibly short runways, learning to coax lumbering machines into the air within mere hundreds of feet. Each man was told, plainly, that the mission was one way. China was their intended sanctuary, but few believed they would all make it. They did not speak of death, but it lingered, uninvited, at the edge of every conversation. Doolittle himself walked among the crews with a calm smile, a steady hand on shoulders, but his eyes betrayed the truth. This was a gamble of staggering proportions. On the morning of April 18th, the gamble grew sharper. Japanese picket boats spotted the task force hundreds of miles from the intended launch zone. Radio messages flashed toward Tokyo, and Admiral William Halsey had no choice. The bombers had to go now, far earlier than planned. It meant flying more than 600 miles over open ocean with fuel reserves already stretched to the threadbare. Doolittle received the word without flinching. "We'll go in anyway," he said. His crew climbed into their aircraft, engines rumbling to life, propellers cutting the mist. The deck heaved under their wheels, sailors crouched against the blast, and one by one the B-25s clawed skyward, their tails skimming the waves before lifting into the wind. The spectacle left even hardened sailors breathless. Men cheered and wept, convinced they were watching a miracle balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Hours later, the miracle touched Japanese soil. The bombers appeared over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, dropping incendiaries and demolition charges on oil tanks, factories, and military facilities. The actual destruction was modest, but the symbolism was colossal. For the first time, Japanese civilians looked skyward and saw American planes where no American plane should be. Fear cracked the myth of invulnerability. Smoke curled above the capital, and air raid sirens wailed in disbelief. Newspapers scrambled to explain the impossible, and military leaders blustered with fury. The empire had been wounded not in the body, but in the heart. For the raiders, the exhilaration of release was swiftly replaced by the terror of return. They flew on, fuel gauges sagging, clouds thickening. Night closed in as they crossed the coast of China, mountains looming invisible in the dark. Some crews crash-landed in fields, others bailed out into cold wind-swept hills. Villagers stumbled upon parachutes tangled in trees, pilots bruised and half-conscious on the ground. A few found safety with Chinese resistance fighters who risked their own lives to shield the Americans from Japanese patrols. Others were not so fortunate, stumbling into the hands of soldiers who showed no mercy. Doolittle himself parachuted into a rice paddy, convinced the mission had been a failure. He would later learn that his daring strike had lifted American morale to unimagined heights, but in that moment, alone in the mud, he felt only the weight of loss. Back in Washington, news of the raid electrified the public. Headlines shouted that Tokyo had been bombed, and Americans clutched at the hope it represented. Roosevelt, with a wry grin, told reporters the planes had come from Shangri-La, a mythical place, rather than reveal the Navy's role. Children in small towns pretended to fly bombers with paper models, their imaginations fired by the daring men who had struck the enemy's capital. For Japan, the raid carried a different message: rage and humiliation. Military leaders seethed that such an affront could happen at all, and their retaliation fell not only on the Americans who had flown the mission, but also on the Chinese villages that had sheltered them. Massacres followed in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, with entire communities erased in reprisal. The raid's legacy was written not only in headlines but in blood. The men themselves were scattered across fortune's cruel spectrum. Most evaded capture, eventually finding their way back to American lines. 8, however, were seized by the Japanese and dragged into captivity. Shackled and beaten, they were forced to stand trial as war criminals, accused of bombing civilians, a charge laced with bitter irony, given Japan's own devastation of Shanghai and Nanking. For these 8, the mission that had begun in thunder ended in silence, the outcome of their fate hidden behind prison walls. The world would not learn their full story until much later. Thus the first act of America's airborne revenge closed with contradictions as sharp as shrapnel. A mission that by all logic should have failed succeeded in striking terror into an enemy's heart. A daring gamble lifted morale at home, yet exacted a savage price in Asia. And amid the celebration of daring, 8 young men sat in cells, their futures balanced on the whims of a furious empire. The raid had proven that America could strike Japan, but it also left a question hanging in the air, heavier than smoke. How would the United States respond when its sons were condemned not as warriors, but as criminals? That answer, when it came, would darken the skies with more than 16 bombers. It would summon an armada. The prison walls were damp with mildew, the air thick with the sour tang of rice gone bad. 8 young Americans sat in cells no wider than closets, their uniforms torn, their hands bound with rough rope that had already rubbed skin raw. These were the survivors of the impossible raid, men who had crossed the Pacific in machines that should not have flown and who now found themselves reduced to shadows behind bamboo bars. Their names: Hallmark, Farrow, Spatz, Meter, Nielsen, Height, Barr, and DeShazer, were whispered in anxious briefings back in Washington, but here in occupied China they were known only as trophies, proof that Japan's shame could be avenged not in battles fought, but in captives broken. The Japanese guards treated them with a cold theatrical cruelty. Beatings came without warning, water was rationed like gold, and the smallest act of defiance was met with fists or rifle butt. Each man clung to scraps of memory: a mother's face, a sweetheart's last letter, the thrum of an engine overhead. Dean Hallmark, calm even in chains, tried to lift the spirits of the others by humming hymns through split lip. Bill Farrow, wiry and restless, filled the silence with talk of home, baseball fields, Coca-Cola, the things that seemed more dream than memory now. Harold Spatz, quiet and deeply faithful, bowed his head in whispered prayers. Robert Meter, worn by fever and malnutrition, drifted between consciousness and delirium, his strength seeping away day by day. They had flown together with bravado. Now their courage was measured in the endurance of hunger and humiliation. The trial, when it came, was little more than a performance staged for a furious empire. Japanese officials dressed in crisp uniforms read charges in clipped tones. The Americans were accused of bombing civilians, of waging war in violation of humanity. The irony was suffocating. Japan had shelled Shanghai, torched Nanking, bombed Manila, yet here they stood as arbiters of justice. The Americans were given no real defense, no counsel to speak for them. Their statements were cut short, their pleas drowned beneath the gavel of vengeance. For the men in the dock, the verdict was carved into the air before a word was spoken. The sentence fell like an iron door, 3 condemned to death, the others spared but imprisoned indefinitely. Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz, names that would one day be etched in stone, but in that moment were simply 3 trembling figures led away under guard. They asked for paper and ink, and though grudgingly granted, it was as though the Japanese were eager for the spectacle of final words. In letters smuggled home months later, the condemned wrote with startling calm. Farrow told his mother he was ready to meet God. Hallmark urged his family to be strong and remember me as I was. Spatz confessed his sorrow at leaving the world so young, but his faith carried him toward peace. Each word, written under the shadow of a rifle, was both farewell and defiance. On October 14, 1942, the 3 were marched into a clearing outside Shanghai. They were blindfolded, bound to posts, and shot by firing squad. The crack of rifles echoed into the forest, and silence rushed in to fill its place. The bodies were hurriedly buried, the news kept secret. For months, their families in America clung to hope, not knowing their sons already slept beneath foreign soil. The Japanese believed they had made an example, a warning to the United States that further attacks would cost more lives. In truth, they had lit a fuse they could not control. The others languished in prison cells for years. Robert Meader's health collapsed. Disease gnawed at him until he slipped away in December 1943, leaving only 7 raiders alive. Jacob de Chazer, a fiery young bombardier, hardened in bitterness at first, but in time found solace in the very faith he had once mocked. Chase Nielsen and the others endured beatings, forced marches, interrogations designed to break their minds as well as their bodies. They survived on scraps of rice, their eyes hollow, their ribs pressing against skin, each day a wager that tomorrow might not come. Yet they lived, and survival itself became a form of victory. Back in the United States, word of the executions trickled through intercepted cables and diplomatic whispers. The government hesitated to release the details, fearing to inflame grief and anger while thousands of American boys still fought in the Pacific. But when the truth emerged after the war, it shook families with the violence of a second death. Mothers received letters confirming their sons had been shot like criminals. Sweethearts who had worn rings on chains around their necks wept into silence. The raid that had given the nation hope had also carved grief into dozens of households, wounds invisible on the home front but as deep as any battlefield trench. Yet for all the sorrow, the executions hardened resolve. In Washington, the deaths of Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were read not as deterrence but as provocation. The Japanese wanted to frighten America into caution, but they achieved the opposite. Military planners spoke in clipped voices of escalation, of striking not with daring gestures but with overwhelming force. Roosevelt, when briefed, pressed his jaw shut and said only, "They shall not have died in vain." In time, those words would be carried by bomb bays large enough to blot out the sky. For the Japanese, the executions were presented as justice, a proud affirmation that even mighty America must bow to their laws. But beneath the surface, doubt simmered. Some officers questioned whether executing prisoners had been wise, whether it had risked inviting retribution too vast to measure. In Tokyo's corridors of power, those doubts were buried beneath rhetoric, but history would prove them prophetic. The empire had lashed out in anger, and in doing so, had painted itself into a corner it could not escape. The surviving raiders, gaunt and broken, were finally liberated in 1945 when American victory rolled across the Pacific like a tide. Photographs taken at the time show men scarcely recognizable, eyes sunken, bodies wasted, yet alive. Their testimony would later reveal the brutality of their captivity, the cruelty of the mock trial, the horror of the executions. They returned to a nation that hailed them as heroes, but the shadows of prison cells never left them. De Chazer would dedicate his life to preaching forgiveness, traveling to Japan itself to speak of grace, while others carried quieter scars into their later years. Their stories became part of a larger narrative, proof of the costs of war and the ways in which cruelty can twist destiny. But in 1942, none of that was yet written. What was clear, in the silence after the rifles cracked in Shanghai, was that Japan had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. 3 men lay in shallow graves, another was fading in a cell, and 4 endured suffering beyond imagination. The Doolittle raid had begun as a symbolic gesture, a defiant strike across the ocean. Now it had become something darker, a blood debt etched in memory. And debts, once written in blood, are never forgotten. America would repay it not with 3 planes, nor with 16, but with an armada of fire waiting to be unleashed. Factories did not sleep in America. Through the night, sparks showered from welding torches, machines roared like caged beasts, and assembly lines moved with a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. The United States had turned its vast industrial body into a single organism of war, pumping out steel and fuel, wings and engines, until the air itself seemed to tremble with potential. The deaths of 3 Doolittle raiders had been written into the nation's memory like scripture, and though no public announcement declared vengeance, every rivet hammered into aluminum, every B-29 rolling off a production line, carried the weight of their loss. The war would not be answered by symbols anymore, it would be answered by fire. The B-29 superfortress was unlike anything the world had yet seen. It was massive, a gleaming predator with a wingspan longer than a city block, its belly capable of carrying bombs across oceans. Crews who first touched its skin described it as both beautiful and terrifying, a machine that promised salvation for some and annihilation for others. It could climb higher than Japanese fighters, fly faster than the winds that whipped across the Pacific, and carry payloads that dwarfed the daring little B-25s of the Doolittle raid. Its very existence was proof that America no longer sought gestures, it sought dominance. General Curtis LeMay emerged as the architect of this new air war. Stocky, blunt, with a cigar clamped between his teeth, he carried little patience for hesitation or sentiment. His men called him Iron Ass for his relentless demands, but beneath the gruff exterior lay a calculating mind that saw warfare as a science of destruction. In the early raids of 1944, LeMay ordered precision bombing of Japanese industry, sending his B-29s to strike factories and shipyards from high above the cloud. Yet the results were disappointing. Jet streams tore formations apart, bombs scattered across rice paddies instead of steel plants, and the weather often cloaked targets in impenetrable fog. American losses mounted, and critics whispered that even the superfortress might not bend Japan to surrender. LeMay's solution was as radical as it was brutal. He ordered the bombers stripped of most guns, lightened to carry more bombs, and sent them low, beneath the jet stream, in the dead of night. Their new cargo was not high explosives but clusters of incendiaries designed to ignite wooden cities like kindling. The logic was merciless. Japan's war effort depended not only on its factories but on the very neighborhoods where parts were crafted by hand. Destroy the cities, destroy the war machine. On March 9, 1945, the experiment began. More than 300 B-29s roared over Tokyo, their bellies emptying torrents of fire. The city became an inferno, flames whipped by wind into firestorms that consumed everything in their path. Asphalt bubbled, rivers boiled, and the air itself became a weapon. In a single night, nearly 100,000 souls perished. Men, women, children turned to ash. Survivors spoke of streets running with molten metal, of bodies piled along canals, of a sky red as the mouth of hell. For the crews above, the sight was both triumphant and unbearable. One bombardier wrote that the glow of Tokyo could be seen from 150 miles away, like a sunrise made of blood. Some cheered, convinced they had struck the decisive blow. Others sat in silence on the return flight, haunted by the knowledge that below the bombs were not only soldiers but families. LeMay brushed aside doubts with a soldier's pragmatism. If you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. It was logic as cold as steel, and in the arithmetic of war, it worked. The firebombing of Tokyo was only the beginning. Night after night, B-29s filled the skies over Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities. By summer, more than 60% of Japan's urban landscape lay in ruins. Survivors staggered through rubble, clutching children, coughing on smoke that clung to lungs like tar. Rice paddies turned into refugee camps, temples into makeshift hospitals. A once proud empire, which had celebrated the executions of captured Americans as proof of its strength, now watched entire cities vanish in hours. Japan's leaders swore publicly to fight on, yet privately some began to whisper that the war could not be won. Amid this devastation, the memory of the executed raiders lingered like a ghost. To their surviving comrades, every mission carried a sense of unfinished business, as though the engines themselves sang with the voices of Hallmark, Faro, Spatz, and Meter. Families at home read headlines of massive raids and felt, perhaps in secret, that their sons had been avenged. Yet vengeance was never so simple. With each firestorm, questions grew sharper. How much destruction was enough? When did justice become something else entirely? These questions, whispered in chapels and barracks, had no easy answer. War rarely gives them. Still, the campaign escalated. By mid-1945, the scale was staggering. More than 20,000 bombers had flown against Japan, their payloads measured not in tons but in mountains of fire. Each sortie deepened the paradox. America, the nation that had begun the war with a desperate symbol of defiance, now commanded the very skies. Its arsenal seemed endless, its resolve unbreakable. To Japanese civilians, the thunder of engines overhead was not merely a sound but a sentence, a reminder that the war they had been told was righteous now rained terror upon their own homes. Yet even as cities burned and thousands died nightly, the Japanese government clung to the hope of endurance. Some leaders believed that if they inflicted enough casualties on invading forces, America might negotiate. Others dreamed of Soviet mediation. But with each passing week, the sky grew darker with American planes, and the fires grew higher. The empire that had tried to frighten America with the execution of 3 pilots now found itself staring into an abyss lit by the wings of 10,000 machines. Among the American crews, weariness mingled with grim pride. They wrote in letters about the surreal beauty of cities glowing beneath them, of fires that looked like rivers of light. Some joked darkly that they were turning Japan into one big charcoal briquette. Humor was a shield, a thin barrier against the enormity of what they were doing. But shields can crack, and in the quiet hours after missions, many confessed unease. Could so much destruction ever truly be called victory? By July, Japan was a nation in ruins, yet still unbowed. The raids had devastated its cities, broken its industry, and left millions homeless, but the government refused to surrender. American leaders faced a terrible question. If 20,000 bombers had not ended the war, what would? The answer was waiting in the desert, hidden behind guarded fences and whispered code names. For all the fire the super fortresses had unleashed, another kind of fire, hotter, brighter, more final, was about to enter the sky. The sun rose over Hiroshima like any other August morning, warm, golden, and deceptively gentle. Children walked to school with books under their arms, women lined up for water, and workers cycled to factories that stood half idle amid shortages. Overhead, the sky was a perfect blue, as if painted by an artist with no knowledge of war. No one saw the B-29 circling high above, a single silver dot against the vast canvas, carrying within its belly not bombs of fire or steel, but something altogether new. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed forever. A flash brighter than the sun tore through the city, shadows burned onto walls, flesh seared into dust. The blast wave roared outward, toppling buildings, hurling bodies, and igniting a firestorm so fierce that rivers boiled and the air itself turned lethal. In a single instant, tens of thousands of lives vanished, and Hiroshima became a name spoken in whispers of awe and dread. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Another sky, another flash, another city reduced to ash. By then, Tokyo's leaders could no longer deny the inevitable. Japan, already crippled by months of firebombing, now faced a weapon beyond comprehension. The emperor himself, divine in title but weary in spirit, recorded a surrender message that spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, and the need to endure the unendurable. For the first time in its history, Japan bowed to defeat. The war that had begun with surprise at Pearl Harbor and bold defiance over Tokyo ended in the silence of cities that no longer existed. Yet behind the sweeping headlines of surrender lay quieter stories, threads woven back to that day in 1942 when 16 bombers had clawed into the sky from the deck of the USS Hornet. The surviving Doolittle raiders, gaunt and hollow-eyed after years in captivity, were liberated from Japanese prisons. Jacob de Chazer stepped into the sunlight with a body broken but a spirit transformed, having found a faith that turned bitterness into forgiveness. Chase Nielsen, silent and dignified, carried scars that would never fully heal. Their fallen comrades, Hallmark, Faro, Spatz, and Meter, did not return, but their memory rode on the wings of every bomber that had crossed the Pacific since. In a sense, their executions had lit a fuse that reached its end in Hiroshima's blinding light. For American airmen who had flown the massive raids of 1945, victory tasted like ashes in the mouth. Letters home spoke of pride, yes, but also of unease. One pilot wrote that watching Nagoya burn was like looking down into hell with the door left open. Another admitted he could not pray without seeing the faces of children running through flames. They were not philosophers, but they felt in their bones that war had crossed a threshold from which humanity could not retreat. The superfortress had become a messenger not only of victory but of moral reckoning. In Japan, survivors staggered through rubble and silence. A girl named Sadako wandered among ruins, searching for her parents, her small hands clutching the charred edge of a school uniform. An old man sat beside the blackened frame of his home, rocking back and forth, whispering names that no longer had voices to answer. Priests rang cracked temple bells over fields of ash, their tones muted by smoke. These images, carried back by correspondence and later seared into photographs, forced the world to confront the cost of vengeance made absolute. Japan had sought to terrify America by killing captured pilots. America had replied by showing what terror truly meant when unleashed from the sky. The irony was sharp and merciless. The men who had been tried as war criminals for dropping a handful of bombs over Tokyo were long gone, but their nation had dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs, culminating in two unlike any ever seen. History's balance sheet was written not in legal arguments but in bodies and ruins. And yet, from those ruins, something unexpected began to stir. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spoke not only of grief but of the need for peace, of ensuring that no city would again endure such fire. In America, some airmen who had once joked darkly about barbecued cities began to campaign against nuclear war. Even Curtis LeMay, architect of destruction, admitted years later that had the U.S. lost the war, he himself might have been tried as a war criminal. The line between justice and vengeance, always blurred, became nearly invisible in the glare of atomic light. But amid this moral fog, one truth stood clear. Small acts of cruelty can ignite storms beyond imagining. The execution of 3 pilots in 1942 had been intended as a warning, a demonstration of Japanese strength and resolve. Instead, it became the seed of an inferno that consumed their cities. What began as a symbolic raid by 16 planes became an aerial campaign of 20,000 bombers, and what began as a handful of bombs ended with 2 detonations that shook the foundation of the modern world. The lesson was not lost on those who survived, though each interpreted it differently. Some as justification, others as caution, still others as tragedy beyond words. In the years that followed, the Doolittle Raiders gathered for reunions, raising silver goblets etched with their names, toasting absent friends. Each year, fewer glasses were filled, more left inverted in memory. Their story, once military secret and propaganda victory, had become legend. They had lived to see their daring raid remembered not only as a symbol of defiance but as the spark that led to the most devastating air war in history. Some carried pride in that, others sorrow, but all understood that history had bound their fates to fire. And so the war's final act closed not with fanfare but with silence, the silence of ruined cities, of prisoners freed too late, of bells tolling over fields of ash. It was the silence that comes after thunder, when ears still ring and hearts still tremble. For the world, that silence carried a question. If vengeance can grow from 3 executions to 20,000 bombers, what might grow from the weapons that ended Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It was a question that would haunt generations, whispered whenever the sky darkened with wings.